Because to explain something is to account for it in terms of something else. To explain the body is to account for it in terms of organ systems. To explain organ systems is to account for them in terms of tissues, tissues in terms of cells, cells in terms of molecules, molecules in terms of atoms. Obviously, you can't keep on playing that game forever, or you would engage into circularity. You would explain the last thing in terms of the very first thing you started from, which is, of course, nonsensical. The game is not to explain everything. That's completely impossible. The game is to explain almost everything in terms of as few things as possible, preferably only one thing. And that's what idealism does. Idealism explains everything in terms of experience, in terms of consciousness. Consciousness itself, therefore, cannot be explained. It's fundamental. You cannot account for it in terms of something else.
Welcome back to the transmission, my friends. If you, like me, are fascinated by the phenomenon, the mystery, the throbbing philosophical questions that surround consciousness and the human condition itself, then this is the mind meld you have been waiting for. Because Bernardo Kastrup not only has a really brilliant take on all of the above, he really has the intellectual chops to back it up. The man holds 2 PhDs, one in philosophy and one in computer engineering. On that note, as a scientist, Bernardo has actually worked for the likes of CERN, but these days he's widely known as one of the most prolific idealist philosophers in the digisphere. He's the author of a number of books, including Science Ideated, Decoding Jung's Metaphysics, Why Materialism Is Baloney, and several more. I truly love musing with Bernardo Kastrup, not only because he's brilliant, but because he makes these big questions fun, and the man is not afraid to get pointy. He's not afraid to go in hard on ideas that he thinks are illogical or don't hold water. We get into so much in this mind meld. Of course, the nature of consciousness and reality itself, Carl Jung and his philosophy, whether or not AI can ever become conscious, the UFO, UAP phenomenon, and just loads more. The necessary keyboard mudras for all things Bernardo Kastrup are in the description. Of course, you know what the currency is here on YouTube. Like, sub, comment, share, all of it is deeply appreciated. Third Eye Drops is also a podcast. We've got over 300 audio-only podcasts that you can only hear wherever you listen to podcasts. They'll never be posted here on YouTube, so sub on your listening platform of choice. Come hang out over on Patreon. We've got a beautiful, budding Wonder Lodge over there. We've got a patron-only Discord. We do Zoom hangs. We do a book club. And so much more, all of it at patreon.com/Third Eye Drops. And with that, friends, let's meld minds with the wise, wonderful, whimsical Bernardo Kastrup.
Bernardo Kastrup. I would dare to say that I have many big-brained, brilliant people on this program, but you are absolutely one of my favorites, one of the most brilliant, because you really approach a lot of life's most interesting, most compelling questions from multiple angles in a way that not very many people can do. So I love talking to you, my friend. I'm so glad you're back.
Pleasure to be here. I just wish I had a self-image as good as the image you have of me.
Oh, well, it seems like people love you. It seems like people love you, and all for the right reasons. You know, you're not like thriving off of controversy. You're not punching down on anybody. You're truly exploring life's mysteries rigorously. And like I said, from a multitude of angles. And that's why I love you so much. Like, we have so many things in common intellectually, but you have just this hyper analytical part of your mind as well. Like, I'm way more of an idea right brained type of person, but it seems like you've merged the two. And I mean, for most people know you have 2 PhDs, one in computer science, one in philosophy. And I guess a good way to start, just to orient everybody, is I won't make you reduce yourself to any ists or isms, But um, maybe just a little bit of background on how you decided that you wanted to make inquiry into these huge questions about the nature of reality, consciousness, um, you know, the human condition. What was the transition like from going from, you did start out as a computer scientist to really exploring these big philosophical questions just so rigorously?
In hindsight, I was always a philosopher from birth. I always had this tendency to look at the world around me and ask the big questions. When my father died, I was 12 years old, and that triggered a whole new round of asking big questions about the nature of life, the nature of death, what is this all about? But beyond just a sort of inborn disposition, this whole thing really started for me when I realized that physicalism or materialism doesn't work. And that's when I was working on AI, which I did some AI work while I was at CERN. We ended up not using that. We used the classical algorithms that I also developed. But in parallel to that, I did some AI work. And at some point, you start asking yourself, if I can build a computer that is as intelligent as a physicist in identifying relevant data, what do I need to do to make it conscious as well? And quickly, if you think carefully about that, quickly you realize that whatever you change in your computer design, it only has to do with structure and function and nothing to do with experience. You're not any closer or any further away from getting it to be conscious than you were before you did any of that stuff. And that applies for whatever you do. And that is a clear sign that you've made wrong assumptions. And now you're facing an internal contradiction of your model of things. And I just had to retrace my steps until I found the wrong turn. And the wrong turn was the very notion that consciousness is something that you can create out of material arrangements. That's the wrong turn. And then I try to correct that because we cannot live in a vacuum of worldviews. We have to have a sort of a tentative narrative about what it is, what is the world is that we are immersed in. And I came up with what today we call an analytic idealism, which is not new, by the way. It was a rediscovery of something that was discovered again and again and again in human history.
Yeah. Yeah. So we're already starting to meander into an area I absolutely want to go with you eventually, which is AI, because we're seeing these technologies come to fruition in an extremely explosive, interesting way in a form that I don't think I even anticipated would appear this quickly. But before we go there, the indefensibility of materialism, as I think you just called it. I mean, you're preaching to the converted, obviously, but for you as somebody who does look at these questions rigorously and analytically, what are some of the core weaknesses of materialism and things that just make it so indefensible and in your mind make it that it just not only is it unlikely, it's impossible?
And there are five equally strong reasons, and each one of them enough for us to discard physicalism or materialism immediately. For instance, explanatory power. Any any theory of reality should account for things, account for facts that are pre-theoretical. In other words, facts that exist regardless of whatever theory of reality you have. Now, the only pre-theoretical fact of nature is the existence of experience, because experience is the carrier of all our knowledge, everything we know. Materialism cannot account for experience, and therefore it cannot account for any pre-theoretical fact. It accounts for precisely nothing. That alone is enough for you to discard it. Um, it is empirically inconsistent. It's based on the notion that physical entities have standalone existence, regardless of observation or measurement. It turns out that unless you entertain some far out science fiction fantasies for which we have zero empirical evidence, unless you do that, we have to abandon the notion that physical things have standalone existence. Physical things are the product of measurement. The thing that is measured is clearly not physical. Another one, it's internally inconsistent. It has internal contradictions. It defines matter as that which has absolutely nothing to do with the experience because it has no qualities, and then tries to explain experience in terms of that which has been defined as having nothing to do with experience.
Right.
That's not going to work. And it doesn't take a genius to realize why. I could go on, but you get the gist of it.
Yeah.
Physicalism is based on very, very simple and self evident errors that were made at a time when people knew they were errors, but insisted on them anyway because there was a power struggle against the church and people could die if they didn't carve out a domain outside psyche, soul, spirit, mind. But since then, we've forgotten what materialism does. You know, we create these numbers, these quantities to describe the world. Quantities like how many kilograms, how many kilometers, how many hertz, how many joules, coulombs. All these physical quantities were invented because they help describe the world we see, this world of qualitative perceptual experience. What physicalism does, it mistakes the description for the thing in itself. It goes ahead and say, well, the 50 kilograms precede the thing that is described through 50 kilograms. In other words, it's like saying that the map precedes the territory and then
Yes.
tries to pull the territory out of the map, which of course is impossible because the map only has meaning if it's referring to a pre existing territory.
Right.
But if the
Right.
territory comes out of the map, then it cannot pre exist the map, and the map therefore has no meaning. And that's what's called the hard problem of consciousness. And we think it's something that is to be solved. It's not something that is to be solved. It's just the internal contradiction of a downright stupid system of thought.
Yes. The map is not the territory, as Terence McKenna liked to say so often, and I'm so fond of that phrase. And it's one of those things that, I mean, you can get yourself into trouble, anytime you confuse the map for the territory, whether it's in your own uh, interpersonal relationships, of course, and your own understanding of the world, as you just pointed out. But yes, I mean, I do think that's one, like, for me, that's one of the most compelling elements, is that consciousness comes a priori of anything else. Like, all that we really know irreducibly is that, oh, I'm having a subjective experience. I am, through some synergy of factors that I have no idea what I am. I as it's so tempting again to reach for the map to explain what my consciousness experience is comprised of, but we have no idea really what qualia is, what this subjective experience that we're having is. We obviously know it's heavily mediated by the brain and neurotransmitters, and a multitude of factors, down to something as mundane as how much sugar have I had today, but when it comes right down to consciousness itself, we really don't know the first thing about what consciousness is, other than we're having that experience, as you pointed out. And what's remarkable about it is, it seems like just through pure introspective investigation, we can reach this conclusion, and not only reach this conclusion, but learn a lot about what it means to be a human being. Because it seems to me like, in a kind of perennial philosophy kind of way, whether you're talking about, like, I was going down a Dzogchen rabbit hole yesterday, a Tibetan Buddhist rabbit hole yesterday, and that whole practice is all about reaching the fundamental ground of being, the fundamental ground of consciousness, and like, understanding that we're all a part of this fundamental ground of consciousness. And of course, this is irreducibly similar, it seems to me, as like Plato's idea of the one that we all are emanating from. And my point being that it's like, it kind of seems like almost every introspective tradition throughout the ages already reached this conclusion. And there are a lot of esoteric trappings around the way they describe it, and how you get there, and what it means, and what it's called. But it seems like that's the primary uniting notion behind pretty much all of, you know philosophy, up to a point. I mean, more recent philosophy has gotten, miles away from that. But so I'm so with you. But for someone who, playing devil's advocate, just so that we're not glad handing each other this whole conversation, um I imagine then a lot of times you're confronted with, so how can we know anything about reality then? Like, what good is science if it's not actually measuring anything real about reality? You know, can we even know anything, or are we just stuck in this matrix of mind and we're playing in this little sandbox, but it's not reality? And maybe then it doesn't even matter, because if it's not reality, but that's what our experience is comprised of, who cares what the nature of reality is? Let's get back to making stuff.
Surely we can know a lot because we are surrounded by a world of clues, a world that doesn't behave in arbitrary, capricious ways. It behaves in very self consistent and regular ways. And these regularities provide a wealth of clues about what might be going on. Ultimate knowledge is impossible and cannot ultimately understand quantum field theory. So, why could we monkeys be able to understand the ultimate truth? No, that we can't. But we surely can make better guesses than we have been making. We surely can see through our own mistakes. Let me make a couple of comments related to the preamble of your question.
Please.
The fact that experience is epistemically primary in the sense that we need to know experience before we can know anything else. The fact that experience is epistemically primary in and of itself does not mean that experience is irreducible. It is logically coherent to say that although we are cooped up in experience, there is something outside experience that generates experience. In other words, physicalism is not immediately logically incoherent. So the argument for analytic idealism is not to say that, well, because all I know is experience, ergo experience is primary. No, this would be a wrong argument. The argument is, one of the arguments is, because all we know is experience, we should postulate something other than experience if we can't make sense of all these regularities based on experience alone.
Hmm.
That's one of the arguments for idealism. There are a whole bunch. So it's not a logical argument, it's an appeal to parsimony. The other arguments are more logical. Um, so it is possible for us to remain level headed um, and cautious about how we make sense of the regularities of nature around us. And this can all be done from a purely empirical and rational perspective without introspection. Now, I do not disregard introspection. As a matter of fact, in my heart of hearts, I consider it the royal avenue to knowledge.
Hmm.
As Schopenhauer said, we must understand nature from ourselves, not ourselves from nature. Having said that, I choose deliberately to focus my entire argument around analytic idealism on empirical evidence, actually laboratory evidence, not even anecdotal evidence,
Hmm.
and analytic reasoning. And the reason I do that is because there are so many people and institutions arguing for analytic idealism from a spiritual perspective, from a meditative perspective, from a psychedelic first person experience perspective, that avenue introspection is well taken care of, and it leads to a general misconception in the culture that that's the only way to justify idealism, and reason and evidence all point to materialism. That's wrong. Reason and evidence defeat, refute, discard, reject materialism and point to idealism too. So that's why I focus my entire story on reason and evidence. And that's enough for us to adopt idealism as the most plausible, perhaps even the only plausible hypothesis we have on the table today.
Hmm. So one core piece, like one core sticking point that I could see someone coming back at you with is how do you take these, because as you pointed out, you it's kind of like the primary and secondary quality classic problem, right? How if you try to reduce something down, you can only weigh and measure. You can never get to the essence of the thing. And since your argument revolves around that matter is fundamentally unreal, and that obviously consciousness, mind are the ground, are reality. So how can we get to that point through this through measuring this flawed, unreal material? Like how do you walk that process
Yeah.
back?
So the first thing we have to acknowledge is that there is a world we inhabit and which presents itself to us in the form of the contents of perception, which we colloquially call the physical world, the things we touch, hold in our hands, the felt concreteness and materiality of a rock. These are felt qualities of experience. They are experiential. This world we see around us, as far as we can know directly, is experiential because it's made of colors, melodies, flavors, scents, textures, and these are all experiential qualities. So we have to acknowledge that there is this world out there that's not in our individual mind. But to say that the world is outside our individual minds is not to say that it's not mental, because your thoughts are outside my individual mind. They are objective from my perspective. If I were not here, your thoughts would still be there. I cannot change your thoughts merely by wishing them to be different. Your thoughts go their merry way, regardless of what I like or dislike, whether I try to change them or not by doing my daily affirmations. In other words, your thoughts are objective and external to my individual mind, but they are mental. So, analytic idealism says that yes, there is an objective world, objective from our perspective, that we inhabit, and this world is out there, and it doesn't care whether we are here or not. It goes its merry way, whether we like it or not. But that world too is mental, because we don't need for it to be other than mental in order to account for nature. And if we don't need to postulate any ontological category, any type of existence beyond the pre-theoretical given, which is experience, then parsimony requires us to not add anything unnecessary to the mix. So that's the argument. Now, how can we dig deeper and find the essential nature of something? How can we know what experience is really?
Yeah.
Now,
This
when
is
you
almost like a platonic question, like it's
yeah,
trying to get to some kind of extant essence of a thing, yeah.
so let me burst the bubble here. Whatever theory of nature any one of us can propose, there is always at least one thing that cannot be explained. Why? Because to explain something is to account for it in terms of something else. To explain the body is to account for it in terms of organ systems. To explain organ systems is to account for them in terms of tissues, tissues in terms of cells, cells in terms of molecules, molecules in terms of atoms, atoms in terms of subatomic particles, and subatomic particles in terms of quantum fields.
Yeah.
So to explain something is to reduce it to something else, is to account for it in terms of something else. Obviously, you can't keep on playing that game forever. You
Right.
can't explain one thing in terms of another forever. Otherwise, you would never reach any satisfactory conclusion, or you would engage into circularity. You would explain the last thing in terms of the very first thing you started from, which is
Mhm.
of course nonsensical. It's a circular reasoning. So the game is not to explain everything. That's completely impossible. The game is to explain almost everything in terms of as few things as possible, preferably only one thing. And that's what idealism does. Idealism explains everything in terms of experience, in terms of consciousness, not your consciousness alone, my consciousness alone, in terms of consciousness as a substrate, as a kind of existent. Consciousness itself, therefore, cannot be explained. It's fundamental. You cannot account for it in terms of something else. It's the foundation of nature. It's the bottom level. It's what simply exists. But if you can explain everything else in terms of consciousness, then that's the very best you can do. Why? Because you're explaining everything in terms of only one thing. Zero is impossible. 10 is bad. 1 is optimal. One element in your reduction base. That's as good as you can do. And that one element is not a theoretical abstraction, it's a pre theoretical given. That's as good as you can possibly do. If you succeed in doing that, nothing else can be better. Actually, everything else has to be worse, because
Mm,
everything else, for instance, physicalism today accounts for everything in terms of 17 quantum fields plus gravity. Um, and even if we could, if one day we can reduce the 17 to 1 in grand unification theories, that one thing is still not consciousness. In other words, it's not the pre theoretical given, it's still a theoretical abstraction that you're adding on top of the given. That's also not as good as idealism.
yeah.
So, what I'm trying to impress upon you is that the game is precisely not to explain consciousness, because that's the best possible
Right.
account of nature you can have, is to not explain consciousness, but explain everything else in terms of consciousness. And that's what we try to do.
Yeah. Consciousness is almost like the zero in binary. It's like it's 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 not there, but it's there. It's like you
It's
can't
what is there. It's the
right.
thing that is
Yeah.
there.
Yeah.
Everything else you can reduce to it. You can explain in terms of patterns of excitation of consciousness, which can be infinite. But the, the one element in your reduction base, the one ontological primitive, as we call it, cannot be explained. In the case of idealism, that is consciousness. And this is a good thing. Any alternative is per force worse.
Mhm. Yeah, it also struck me when you were talking about constantly trying to reduce any system down to the next most basic measurement or mouth noise that we use to make sense of how things work. You did a great job also, I think maybe not purposefully, of explaining the Buddhist idea of emptiness, how the more you try to dig in to the essence and the nature of the thing, you ultimately find that it's not really there, that it's like this construct of consciousness within consciousness, because it just you zoom in a little more and a little more and a little more, and you find out, well, this really isn't the concept, this really isn't the thing, there's nothing there, um and
There's
that on its
nothing
own
there.
is
There's nothing there other than the consciousness that is trying to figure out what is there.
so your argument is that consciousness is would have to be then self-caused, right? Like consciousness would have to be um somehow like a
It's
like self-caused.
uncaused.
Okay, okay.
It's
Hmm.
not self-caused, because to be self-caused, the thing that is self-causing needs to pre-exist its own existence in order to cause itself. That, analytic, I mean, this could work as a spiritual metaphor in some kind of koan, but analytically it doesn't work. It's an eternal contradiction. So consciousness is uncaused. There has to be something uncaused in nature. From a philosophical perspective, this is absolutely necessary.
So I had a neuroscientist on who wrote a book. I think you would disagree with, but I think you would like him and you would probably like the book. It's called The Romance of Reality. And he's warm to the idea that consciousness is a real phenomenon, but as a neuroscientist he still can't get beyond the sort of epiphenomenal nature of experience, and that because he knows the processes of the brain so well that he cannot get behind the idea that there could be some kind of consciousness without a brain, because he can you know talk me under the table in terms of like cognitive technicals. So I have nothing else to do but respond with more philosophical, artful language. But how would you respond to that argument as sloppily as I laid it out? I think you get the idea. I think people
Yeah.
get the idea. Yeah.
Most people who come from a physicalist background, or physicalism is embedded into their minds because of the culture which saturates their hidden assumptions, even when they realize that they cannot really make sense of consciousness in materialist terms, they end up falling into a dualist trap. And the rationale goes as follows: there is this physical thing called the brain. And it obviously is directly correlated with experience. Because if I take this physical thing called a needle and I stick it in my arm, I feel pain. So there we go, a physical thing causing a mental thing. Or if I take a very physical glass of scotch and I drink it, something changes in my mind. So there we go, a very physical thing, a glass of scotch. And when I drink it, boom, something changes in my mind. So, yeah, there is an arrow of causation from physical things to mental things. That's how it goes. This is dualism. And it's obviously flawed. And everybody agrees that dualism doesn't work. It's just about the only sort of, by and large, consensus in philosophy. Not an absolute consensus. There are still people arguing for it, but it doesn't work. The error is the following: we have been indoctrinated over 2, 3, almost 4 centuries, maybe, with the notion that that glass of scotch, that needle, that pill, that surgeon's scalpel are non mental things. And that's the problem. Let me give you a different narrative, a different interpretation of what's going on. Obviously, brain states correlate with experiential states. You take an antidepressant, your brain states change. Oh, lo and behold, your depression changes, your mental states change. That has multiple possible accounts from a logical perspective. One of them is the following: brain states are what mental states look like when observed from a certain perspective. And I'm not going to get into the technicalities of what that perspective is. Technically, it's when it's observed from across a dissociative boundary, but let's not get into the technicalities. Matter is what mental states look like when observed from a certain perspective. All matter: the glass of scotch, the needle, your brain, your body. Material states are the appearance, the cognitive representation of mental states when observed from a certain perspective. And that's why they correlate. So when that glass of scotch changes your mental states, what you're having there is a mental process that appears to you as a glass of scotch, causally affecting another mental process, your conscious inner life. And that one mental process affects another is trivial. Your emotions affect your thoughts affect your emotions. This is happening every day. Mental processes of different types have causal influences on one another. That needle is what a mental process in nature, not in your own mind, a mental process in nature looks like when you observe it. The needle being stuck into your arm is an interaction between mental processes. And the result of that is the mental process we call pain. So it's mental processes with mental processes. There are no physical things in the sense of things that are non mental. That's the underlying assumption of materialism. And we need to critically examine that assumption. We cannot analyze idealism based on a physicalist assumption, because then you're not looking at idealism as it is. You're looking at your own misconception, misinterpretation of idealism. You're creating a straw man and then burning it. There are no needles as things outside mind. There are no glasses of alcohol as things outside mind. There are no surgeon scalpels as things outside mind. They are outside an individual mind, maybe all individual minds. But the scalpel, the alcohol, the pill, the needle, these are what mental processes in nature at large, in mind at large, look like when you observe them. And their causal impact on your mental inner life is a interference of two mental processes which have causal effects on one another. Of course, there's nothing extraordinary about any of this. It's perfectly logical.
I follow. I follow. And so let me kick something your now that we've gone down this road. I feel like this might be an interesting time to kick you the AI question under a slightly different pretense, because at first I knew where you were going to go, because you're not an epiphenomenalist, clearly. So the notion that consciousness could arrive out of extraordinarily informationally dense computer systems and protocols and stacks of code does not jive with your explanation of reality. However, if at their core all of those things I just mentioned are processes within the larger mental process, by that vector, would it be possible for AI to obtain some level of, I don't know if consciousness is the right word, but self-awareness, so that it operates as a being with agency and appears to be conscious?
No. And the reason for that, I mean, some people who hear about idealism for the first time, they tend to think, oh, this means that conscious AI is possible because consciousness is fundamental. It's always there anyway. So
Yeah.
therefore, a computer is conscious. No, because when we say that a thing is conscious, we mean by it more than merely that there is consciousness. What we mean is that there is consciousness bound by the boundaries of that individual. In other words, that there is private conscious in your life, not only consciousness at large, but private conscious in your life, correlated with the colloquially physical boundaries of a certain being. Like me, if you look at my body, you know that associated with my body, there is conscious inner life of my own that is inaccessible to you. It's private to me. And that consciousness is bound by the colloquially physical boundaries of my body, in the sense that if you stick a needle in my arm, I feel it, but if you stick a needle in the chair I'm sitting on, I don't feel it. That's what we mean. To say that something is conscious is to say that it has private consciousness bound by its colloquially physical limitations. And so it's more than to say that consciousness is there somewhere, you see? Now, do we have any reason to think that a silicon computer has private conscious inner life of its own in a way analogous to how you and I have private conscious inner lives of our own? I would say none whatsoever. As far as we can determine, a silicon computer is not a thing. There are no things in the inanimate universe in the sense of subsets of the universe that have ontological boundaries. The boundaries between things are nominal, they are epistemic. These are projections we make onto the inanimate universe. In other words, we carve out things out of the universe. To give you an example, where does the river end and the ocean begin?
Right.
That differentiation is a language thing. It's to facilitate communication. The structure of language, however, is not the ontic structure of reality. Why would it be? Or if you have a table with four legs, you pull out one leg, did you just create another thing? Or if a rock detaches from a mountain coming bouncing down the mountain, did you just create another thing? So if the mountain was conscious, did the rock suddenly acquire private conscious inner life of its own the moment it detached itself? And does it merge again with the consciousness of the mountain every time it bounces off the mountain? You get into this kind of illogical things because there are no inanimate things. Things are arbitrary, nominal carvings out of nature that we create in order to be able to communicate. Even the boundaries of a car, if you say, well, the boundaries of a car are determined by what you need in order for the car to work, for the car to move. So, for instance, if you take the sparks plug out, the car doesn't move. So the spark plugs are part of the car. Yeah, but if you follow this reasoning, for the car to move, you need the road for the tires to grip. So the road is part of the car. Oh no, you also need the gravity to pull the car towards the road. Otherwise, the car also doesn't move. Okay, so you need the planet to be part of the car. Oh,
Right.
but wait a moment, you need the air to cool the radiator and to enable combustion, otherwise the car doesn't move. All right, so the atmosphere is part of the car. And then if you go and dig deeper and you go to quantum entanglement and put that together with the idea of the Big Bang, you realize that there are no things at all. To account for anything, you need the entirety of the inanimate universe.
Yeah.
So there are no things. Computers are not things, therefore they cannot have conscious in their life of their own. Are human things? Yes, humans are things, because the boundaries that delineate our existence as individuals are not nominal. Because if I stick a needle in my arm, I feel. If I stick a needle in the wall, I don't feel. And that's not nominal. That's not arbitrary. That's empirical. Certain things I feel, certain things I don't feel. The things that I feel always interact with the surface of this entity I call my body. So individual living beings are actually things. Nothing else is. So, look, sorry, I'm speaking too much, but I'm
No, no, not
passionate
at all.
about this subject because it's
Of
right
course.
on the intersection between my two specialties, which is computers and philosophy.
Yeah.
Um, when a computer scientist, or together with a neuroscientist, when they analyze the patterns of information flow in a human brain, and then they replicate those patterns of information flow in a silicon computer, and then they say, therefore the computer has private conscious inner life of its own, just like the brain had. The mistake they are making is so stupid it hurts. The exact same mistake is made in the following hypothetical scenario. I study, together with a physiologist, kidney function in a human being in all its detail, down to the molecular level, how kidneys work in human beings. And then I create a simulation of kidney function on my computer, on my iMac, right in front of me right now. A simulation that is accurate down to the molecular level. Therefore, my iMac should be on my desk. Of course not. The simulation of kidney function is not kidney function.
Right.
But when we talk about conscious AI, that's the mistake we are making. We are saying the simulation of information flows in a human brain, when we simulate that in a silicon computer, that is a human brain and therefore should have private conscious inner life of its own. No! Put a human brain on a table next to a silicon computer and you realize how absolutely different those things are. So it takes a kind of uncritical, naive, foolish imagination to think that a AI, which is made to imitate the patterns of information flow in a human brain, uh, should be conscious in the sense of having private conscious in their life. We have absolutely no reason to believe that. This is a fairy tale that our culture somehow reified to the status of something plausible. And that's absurd. It's stupid. It's very important, very, very important that when we see stupid things, we call them stupid. Otherwise, soon we will all have to be discussing nonsense with a very thoughtful hand in our chins. Like, oh, maybe. No, this is the end of a culture. This is the end of us. It's the
Wow.
end of reason. Conscious AI is stupid. And it's important that we call it stupid. Anyway, that's my rant.
I assume you followed the whole Blake Lemoine thing with the Google AI system that
Oh,
this engineer Blake Lemoine who
yeah.
he I've heard him, I've actually heard him on a couple podcasts. He very articulate, really interesting guy, very interested in philosophy and the esoteric. And side note, I feel like what we've really done, and by we, I mean not myself in any capacity. Though I do, by the way, I share your interest in the intersection between computer science and philosophy because in a previous vocation, I was a network infrastructure engineer. So a few different layers on the OSI model away from you, and probably much,
Oh, the
much,
OSI model. I
much dumber.
haven't heard that
Right?
in
Yeah,
a
yeah,
long
yeah.
time.
A much much dumber layers of the OSI model than you dealt with. But anyway, he is a thoughtful guy and he is approaching it from interesting philosophical angles and esoteric angles. And when you read the transcript of their conversations, it's remarkable, and it really does seem like this thing has some kind of subjective inner life. So this is sort of a twofold question. Um, One, going back to this notion that I think you called it binding, like there's something binding consciousness to create a private subjective experience within the confines of the, not within the confines, but operating via the human biological gestalt, right? Like somehow this biological gestalt is somehow operating with a private subjective reality. So in that, obviously that binding process is some kind of black box that I don't think
Well,
we.
binding requires a form of dualism. To bind consciousness to something physical, I would just say uh, our private conscious inner life is associated to a body in the sense that it can be observed from the outside in the form of a body. But I wouldn't talk about binding because binding it presupposes some form of dualism. Even
Yes,
if just property dualism, it still presupposes dualism, which I think is untrue.
I follow. So it's more that with a human being, you a human being in a way is a sprouting from the ground of consciousness, whereas it's the reverse in any kind of man-made scenario, right? Like we have another entity, another conscious entity creating some other thing, some other physical thing. Therefore, it's not going through that same arising process as a human being, where it started as this probably some kind of seed of consciousness and then sprouted into this, um, this more magnificent, multifaceted form of consciousness. So I guess in that way of thinking, there's something special about the relationship between biology and this private consciousness, that although consciousness is obviously not arising out of the biology epiphenomenally, it is codependent
It's
somehow.
correlated with it in a very
Yeah.
tight way, of course. Look, so to start from the preamble of your question and the Google AI chatbot that was considered conscious by an
Oh,
engineer.
yeah. And can I just sort of
Yeah,
flesh that part out real quick for you? If we get to this point where the somehow these things are operating in the world, walking around and screaming when they're punched, and having different needs and things like that, would you be okay with inflicting damage? I mean, other than property destruction, would you feel any guilt? You know,
none,
do
none at all.
okay.
I would be happy to behead one of them if it needs to be done.
All right.
You see, the key distinction here is not whether something has arisen spontaneously in nature, like life has, or whether it has been created by human beings, because human beings are also part of nature. So you could say that our products have also arisen in nature. We are not separate from nature. So I don't think that is the key distinction. The key distinction is similar but different. So I understand your intuition. I understand why you were hinting at that. I think your intuition is correct. But the key distinction here is the following: we were not created to imitate anything else. Human beings arose not in order to imitate something else, they arose because from an evolutionary perspective, we embody high fitness. That's why we arose. But an AI chatbot was made to imitate human language. It was made as an imitation. Therefore, that it resembles us doesn't mean that it should be conscious like us, because the resemblance is by construction. It was made to imitate us. Let, let's transpose the exact same thought to a different thing so people understand the intuition. Um, you know those mannequins used in shop windows
Of
to
course, yeah.
display clothes?
Mhm, mhm.
Those mannequins were made to imitate human beings. But it's not for that reason that we go around discussing the ethical principles of mannequins or the rights of mannequins, because you know that the similarity is there not because they really are like us, but because they were made to imitate us in certain ways. But when it comes to a chatbot, we make exactly that mistake. We think that we should discuss the rights of the chatbot just as the idiot would think that we should discuss the rights of shop mannequins, shop window mannequins. So it is not at all surprising that we could engineer a chatbot to speak like a human being. Why? Because we constructed it to imitate the way human beings talk. So we shouldn't now be surprised. Oh my God, it talks like a human being. No, it was made for that. It was made as a good imitation. That's what Google invested millions to create, and some of the best engineering brains around to create a good imitation. And therefore, we know that it is just that, an imitation. It's not another instantiation of human minds. It's an imitation of human minds. So to think that it's conscious, it's like thinking that the shop window mannequin is conscious just because it looks like a human being in certain ways. In many other ways, the shop mannequin doesn't look at all like a human being. You slice it in half and you look at what's inside, it's not at all what a human being looks like. Take a chatbot AI. Let's look at what a chatbot AI really is. It's a collection of bazillions and of open or closed microscopic electronic switches made out of silicon, metal, and oxides with electrons flowing through them. It doesn't look at all like a brain, which is made of carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, a lot of water, and neurotransmitters flowing across neurons, across the synaptic clefts. They don't look at all like one another. Just like the mannequin doesn't look like a human being if you look more deeply. To say that a chatbot AI should be conscious because it looks like a human being when it comes to language is exactly the same error as to say that a shop window mannequin should be conscious because it looks like a human being when it comes to bodily form. Both are just downright stupid, and we should call it stupid because it is stupid.
Is there some possible way that you could have two completely different engine architectures, let's say, where you have the internal combustion engine, and then you have, well, we'll just say this is overly simple, but an electric motor in a Tesla, not the
Yeah,
same thing, but
but doing the
accomplishes
same thing.
a
Yeah,
very similar end.
yeah.
is
Of
is
course,
there is there a way in your worldview that there could be an artificial, I guess, apparatus for consciousness?
let's first acknowledge that the hypothesis you're bringing forward is not illogical. In other words, it is logically possible. It may even be physically possible. But whether it's fully possible, it's a different question. But
Right.
logically possible, it certainly is. There is nothing in logic that precludes the possibility of two different instantiations leading to the same phenomenon of private conscious inner life. So that's logically possible. The fact that it's logically possible, however, doesn't tell us much at all. Let me give you another example of something that is logically possible and even physically possible. There might be a 19th century teapot in the orbit of Saturn right now. It's logically possible. It's also physically possible. Aliens could have come to the Earth in the 19th century, stolen a teapot from an old lady's living room, taken it with them as they're going back home, got bored of it by the time they were around the orbit of Saturn, dumped it, and the teapot got captured by Saturn's gravitational well. And now it's in the orbit of Saturn. It's logically and physically possible. Does it mean that it's useful to entertain the hypothesis? No, not at all. We have no reason to believe it. The important thing is what we have reasons to entertain seriously, not what is logically or physically possible. I'll give you an example of another logically and physically possible hypothesis. The flying spaghetti monster, a hyperdimensional being that is invisible to us because it's in a hyperdimension, is what is moving the planets around their orbits with the gravitational force of its noodly appendages. It makes the planets go around the sun. This is logically and physically possible. And it's consistent with the evidence. The planets do go around the sun. But do we have any reason to entertain seriously the hypothesis of the flying spaghetti monster? No, none whatsoever. In other words, there are infinite hypotheses that are logically and even physically coherent, possible, but which we would just be wasting our time entertaining. You see?
Yes, of course.
And
Yeah.
that a silicon computer can have private conscious inner life of its own is one of those hypotheses. It's logically possible. It may not be physically possible, but logically it is. Now, we know what do we know from nature then? Nature is what teaches us what we have reasons to take seriously or not. So let's look at nature. Nature is showing us that biology, metabolism, is the thing that seems to correlate with private conscious inner life.
Hmm.
How do I know that? Well, I know that because I know I have private conscious inner life. I know I'm conscious, and I know my consciousness is private. People can't read my thoughts ordinarily. Moreover, my consciousness is bound. I don't know what's happening in China right now, let alone the galaxy of Andromeda. So I know that about me. And when I look at myself in the mirror, I see a biological organism entirely analogous to other entities I see around me, which are also biological organisms. And they behave just like me in ways that are consistent with conscious inner life. They scream when they are in pain, and they are metabolizing entities. So I take it on not on face value, but I consider there to be enough empirical evidence for me to take seriously the hypothesis that you are conscious, even though I cannot know that absolutely for sure. But I live my life as though that is the case. And I can say the same about all other living beings. My cat behaves in a way that is consistent with conscious inner life, and it metabolizes. An amoeba behaves in a way consistent with conscious inner life. Did you know that amoeba build houses out of little mud particles they pick from
Wow.
the bottom of their puddle? They build little houses in the form of cone shells made of mud, and they live inside them. They go after food, they run away from danger. All the behaviors of me. I also build things. I go after food. I run away from danger. And the amoeba, if you look with a microscope to the molecular level, metabolizes just like me. Does things like DNA transcription, protein folding, burns ATP for energy. All this stuff. The
Yeah.
analogy is complete. It's structural, dynamical, and behavioral analogies. So nature is telling us that what private conscious inner life, in other words, dissociated consciousness dissociated from its cognitive environment, which is the universe at large, what that looks like is metabolizing biological organisms, which can be very different as an amoeba is different from me, but very similar in terms of all the fundamentals, structure, dynamics, and behavior. They are also metabolizing entities. That's what nature is telling us. Now, is a computer analogous to that? You could say the behavior might be analogous, but then it is analogous by construction. It's analogous because it was made to imitate a living being.
Yes.
So that doesn't count. And even if it did count, the structure and the dynamics are totally different. A computer is made of silicon and operates by electron flow, while living beings are made of carbon and operate by ATP burning and the release of neurotransmitters if these living beings have nervous systems.
Yeah.
So, no, we have absolutely no reason to think that a silicon computer will ever have private conscious inner life of its own. No reason. Is it logically possible? Yes, it is. But that means exactly nothing. The flying spaghetti monster is logically possible. Now, that's not your question. Your question is not whether silicon computers could have private conscious inner life, but whether something created by humans could have private conscious inner life. Do
Yes.
I believe that? Yes, I believe that.
Hmm.
Not only do I believe that, I believe it will happen.
Hmm.
We will do it, but that thing will look like a cell. That
Ah,
thing
okay.
will look like a metabolizing living being. Actually, it will be a metabolizing living being created in a laboratory. In other words, conscious AI is the same thing as abiogenesis, as the creation of life from non life by artificial means. Will we do that? I have no reason to believe we will not. We already managed to synthesize DNA and put it inside a cell such that the cell became what was programmed by the DNA. But unfortunately, that cell was already alive before we did it. So we didn't
Ah.
create life from non life. We reprogrammed life.
Hmm.
And creating life from non life is proving to be an exquisitely difficult problem. But I do
Interesting.
not see any reason why it's a fundamental problem. I think it will be solved. We
Hmm.
will create conscious AI, but it will be a living being. It will be wet, moist, and metabolizing, and it will die if you slice it in half. Well, maybe not, because planaria can be sliced in half, and all you get is two planaria,
Yeah. Yeah.
and they don't die. But this is what I mean. Conscious AI and abiogenesis are not just analogous, they are one and the same technological challenge.
Very interesting. And in my mind, the back of the shovel is hitting the dirt on the grave of the conscious AI idea. Right. I guess right next to that we can bury the idea of uploading your consciousness somehow too, because that uh that seems like it follows all the same logical beats there. Um,
That requires us to invent another word because stupid is not bad enough for it.
Yeah, and I mean, in a way, in a way, I get it. I totally understand the attraction, the romance of it, the challenge of it, and I'm warm to it in those ways. But for all of the reasons you laid out, and probably more, it doesn't jive with me either. It never has fully
It's
jived
a
with
fairy
me.
tale. It's
Yeah.
a fairy tale. It's a myth. And because we lost our connection, the real connection to myth, which is stories that embody archetypal truths but are not literally true, we forgot that. Now we think myths are just lies
Mm-hmm.
or
Mm-hmm.
untruths. But our natural intuition to relate to myth didn't go anywhere. It's still there. So it needs to express itself in other ways.
Yes.
And the
Yes.
other ways is science fiction endorsed by scientists who are terrible philosophers and set about doing philosophy as if it were science. So, for instance, we now take seriously entirely arbitrary notions for which we have precisely zero empirical evidence. We now take them seriously, like the notion that after each and every quantum interaction or measurement, a parallel universe splits into existence.
Yes. 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 Yes.
We have zero evidence for that. This is entirely arbitrary. And the rationale is the following: because our quantum theory that we invented in order to get a handle on nature's behavior, because that theory of ours is not powerful enough to predict the outcome of every quantum event, therefore, every quantum event should actually happen in a parallel universe. In other words, the limitations of our abilities to predict nature now imply that nature is a mushrooming gazillion of parallel universes for which we have zero empirical evidence. This is so absurd, it hurts. We are projecting our limitations on ontological facts of nature.
Yeah.
There is nothing more arrogant, naive, and silly. And yet we take it seriously. Why? Because it's romantic and it sort of gives expression to our neglected and repressed need to relate to myth. So this has become our modern myth. Parallel universes, they just won an Oscar,
Yeah.
huh? Parallel
Right. Yeah,
universes
yeah,
have
yeah,
just
yeah.
won seven
Great movie.
Oscars.
Great movie, by
Yeah.
the way. Yeah. Um, so
And conscious AI is another of these fairy tales.
yeah, and many worlds theory does not sit well with me either. And you very very in close proximity, you said the word archetype and myth, and I was going to use that as an opportunity to leap into Jung because I love Jung, deeply interested, highly influenced by him. But I also kind of want to meander into the quantum a little bit because that's also an interest of mine. And it's also, there are so many pitfalls there because it's been wielded in very dubious new age ways with no substantiation in so many respects. However, as far as I can tell with my pea-sized brain, there is some irreconciled possibility that consciousness is involved in wave collapse. That when you have an observation, you can't divorce that observation from consciousness, no matter how many, tools or, you're intermediating that are intermediaries between the process of consciousness and measurement. There's always consciousness involved. And I guess to just walk this back a little bit, um, there is this mysterious thing that they call the quote unquote measurement problem in quantum physics, which is how do you get from a potential, a field of possibilities, to having something pop into empirical reality with measurable qualities. There's this chasm there that only occurs, at least from a human perspective, when the thing is measured. So, this measurement problem is something that's been explained in many different ways, and the many worlds theory is one way to explain it, and there are other theories. And most scientists today will completely try to downplay the idea that consciousness has any role whatsoever in wave collapse and in the measurement problem. But if you go back and you look at what Wigner said, you go back and look at um, what Schrodinger said, clearly they took the idea of consciousness seriously and that consciousness could be involved in really forming reality through some kind of measurement. To me, it seems like that was a very unsettled question in their minds, yet now it's brushed off as this cartoonish idea. What are your thoughts on this?
The notion that consciousness is in some way associated with measurement arises from the uh, trivial fact that when we look at the world, we see one thing and not a superposition of possibilities.
Right,
We always only see one thing and not a superposition of possibilities.
right.
And so consciousness always registers one thing. So in some way, it's associated with collapse. I acknowledge that. It's obvious. Quantum theory would tell you, and quantum theory is not reality. Quantum theory is our model of reality. Our model of reality, as von Neumann made clear in the early 1930s, is such that when two systems interact, they just become entangled. In other words, whatever superposed possibilities there were in one and in the other, they just become mutually superposed. The whole system becomes entangled, and it doesn't lead to one concrete possibility being true. You still have an entangled superset of superposed possibilities. So interaction doesn't bring reality down from possibilities to one thing, it just entangles everything. And yet, when we look, we see only one thing, not an entangled whole of superposed possibilities. So that must have something to do with consciousness. I agree. The error, I think, is when we say, therefore, consciousness causes something in the physical world, because this
Mm,
is already appealing to dualism. This is already saying there is consciousness here and there is a physical world there, and consciousness has this magical ability of collapsing the richness of the physical world into only one concrete possibility. No, I think that's nonsense. I don't think our individual consciousnesses have this Superman, well, it's beyond Superman. This is a magical power of changing the whole universe out there by a mere act of observation. I don't think that's happening at all. I think we should be very sober about the, acknowledging that this is an appeal to magic. It's like saying that we have the power of changing what's happening in the galaxy of Andromeda by the mere act of looking through a telescope. And then that cloud of superposed possibilities that the galaxy of Andromeda would otherwise be suddenly collapses into only one possibility because little Bernardo here on Earth put his eye on the lens of a microscope, of a telescope. I mean, hello. Nature doesn't seem to work like this. I don't think this is what's happening. I think the problem here is the following, Michael. We mistake the limitations of our models
Hmm.
for realities out there. The wave function is not reality, it's not ontic, it's epistemic. The wave function captures what we know about reality. And it so happens that we don't know enough to go from possibilities to defined facts. We don't know enough to make that jump. In other words, collapse is not a phenomenon of nature out there. Collapse is just a word to identify the limits, the epistemic limits of our ability to model nature's behavior.
Yes.
That's all there is to it. We are not yet in a position to predict exactly what nature will do next. All we know is to correctly calculate the probabilities as
Right.
ensembles. We know what the probabilities are of what nature might do next, but we cannot predict exactly what it will do next. This is not collapse, something happening up there. This is just a step in our ability to model things that we haven't made yet. When we look, we see one thing.
Yes.
And when we
Yes.
model it, we cannot predict that one thing. We get stuck on probabilities. Well, that's just the limitation of our knowledge.
Yeah.
It's not a magical process happening out there in nature. You see?
I don't know. I think within the span of what you just said, we created 50 different universes, Bernardo, because you could have said all those other things. So therefore, we must have 50 other universe. I'm joking, but yeah, your point is well taken. That it's not like quantum non-locality seems strange, but it's only because you're juxtaposing it against relativity that doesn't allow
Oh,
that to exist.
that's different. And we were talking about the measurement problem, which
Oh, right.
doesn't
But just to
doesn't require entanglement between different systems and non-locality.
but like just as another example of this was the thing that Einstein and the EPR trio fought tooth and nail against because they were trying to show the supposed absurdity of quantum physics because it violated all of these quote unquote laws by proposing things like
But
non-locality. But now that
that
it's
is more
accepted.
interesting.
Yo, go ahead. Yeah.
That is more interesting. That's not trivial. That's much more interesting than the measurement problem. It's not what we talked about. If you want, we can talk
Oh,
about
sure.
the
Yeah.
EPR paradox. And
Yeah, let's go. Yeah, please.
okay, that is a different thing. The measurement problem is the following: you have one quantum system in a superposition. In other words, a superposition of possibilities. But when you measure it, you see only one. And we cannot predict which one we will see. We can only predict the probabilities. If we make many measurements, we know how the probabilities will align, but we cannot predict the outcome of one measurement. That's the measurement problem. How you go from one system in a superposition to one measurement result. The EPR paradox, the Einstein Podolsky Rosen paradox, or the entanglement paradox, is the following. It's much more interesting. Suppose two elementary subatomic particles, say two photons, are prepared together so they are entangled.
Yeah.
And then you shoot one in one direction at the speed of light, and the other one you shoot in the opposite direction at the speed of light. Let's call them photons A and B. They are created, created together, prepared together, and shot in opposite directions at the speed of light. Now, suppose that at one end, far away, scientist Alice is waiting for photon A to arrive. And on the other end, very, very, very far away, maybe on the other side of the universe, scientist Bob is waiting for photon B to arrive.
Yeah.
When the photons arrive, and they will arrive at the same time because Bob and Alice are equidistant to the point from where the particles were shot. When they arrive, Alice chooses to make a measurement on photon A and makes that measurement. And Bob makes a measurement on photon B on the other side of the universe. As it turns out, what Alice chooses to measure about photon A determines what Bob sees when he measures photon B. Let me repeat this.
Yes, yes.
to
I follow.
sentient.
I made a video on this actually, but for everybody
Okay.
listening, please, yes.
What Alice chooses to measure, for instance, the axis of angular momentum. It could be any property. What Alice chooses to measure about photon A determines what Bob sees when he measures photon B at the same time on the other side of the universe. What this means is that the properties of photon B are determined by Alice's choice on the other side of the universe. The physical properties of a particle do not pre exist measurement. Otherwise, regardless of what Alice chooses to measure about photon A, photon B would still be whatever it is. Photon B would have standalone reality. Measurement would simply unveil the properties it already had immediately prior to measurement. But as it turns out, those properties don't seem to have been there before measurement because they depend on what Alice chooses to measure on the other side of the universe. Physical properties, and therefore physical entities, because physical entities are defined by their physical properties arise from measurement. They are not whatever it is that we actually measure. Physical properties are like what dials on a dashboard show after you've made the measurement. They are not the thing measured. The world before observation isn't physical. In other words, it's not amenable to description through physical properties, because physical properties, it turns out, do not pre exist measurement. The only way for you to go around this is to entertain one and another complete fantasy that is physically coherent but highly inflationary and for which we have absolutely zero empirical evidence. Two of them in particular, well, three. One of them is Bohmian mechanics, which has been, now it's buried. It has been experimentally disconfirmed. Moreover, it doesn't have a relativistic extension, so it can't be reconciled with special relativity, and therefore it cannot be true. So forget that. There are two that are not refuted yet, but are like the flying spaghetti monster. I can't refute it, but we shouldn't take it seriously. One of them is the Wigner's interpretation of parallel universes, that whatever you measure, all possibilities of results do happen, but in parallel universes that are inaccessible and for which we have zero empirical evidence. Or you have to entertain the fantasy of superdeterminism, which is not even determined. We don't know what these hidden variables of superdeterminism are supposed to be. It's like an appeal to God, whatever. I don't know how, but nature operates in such a way that my favorite physical prejudice is true, although experiments are telling me the opposite.
Can I interject real quick? I have a question. So my understanding was that the Wigner's friend thought experiment, how essentially all right, let me try to explain this succinctly. Most people are familiar with the idea of of Schrodinger's cat, and the cat being in the box where it's in. You don't not only do you not know whether it's alive or dead, closed in this box, it's neither alive nor dead until it is measured or apprehended. And Wigner's friend bolts onto that by saying that chain of logic really goes all the way back until you get a sort of cosmic consciousness where consciousness itself is witnessing itself all the way back. And this is why we have phenomenal things, because you have this chain reaction of witnessing essentially going back all the way into the cosmos. But I didn't know Wigner also was a parallel universes
Yeah, I was not
guy.
talking about Wigner's friend.
Okay.
I was talking about Wigner's interpretation of quantum mechanics. Oh no, Wigner's interpretation is actually consciousness causes collapse. You're right. That's Everett. I should have said Everett
Okay. Yes.
hypothesis of. Sorry, you caught me there. You're correct. So
It,
the audience
lightning
heed
strikes
this.
once. Lightning strikes once, Bernardo.
That would be Everett's many worlds interpretation, not Wigner's. Wigner's is consciousness causes collapse. I think both are literally wrong, although Wigner's is closer to the truth of it. But the point I'm trying to make is not the Wigner's friend paradox. The point I'm trying to make is that unless you entertain fantastically inflationary fantasies for which we have zero empirical evidence, the results of more than 40 years, which have earned the Nobel Prize in Physics
Yeah.
last year, by the
Yeah.
way, show us that physical entities do not exist prior to measurement. They are created by measurement. Measurement doesn't just unveil pre-existing physical properties. Physical properties are the result of measurement. The thing that is measured is not physical in the sense of not being characterizable through physical properties. Now, this seems mysterious if one thinks that the world out there, which obviously exists, a world that exists prior to measurement, it obviously does. There has to be something for us to measure in order for us to even speak of the measurement problem, right? So there is a world out there that is not dependent on measurement. But if you think that that world can only be physical, now you have a problem. Now you have a contradiction. Because if the world that we measure is physical, then what Bob sees should not depend on what Alice chooses to measure.
Right. Right.
Bob will see whatever is there prior to measurement. Measurement will simply unveil it. That's not what happens. So the world cannot be physical. Physicality is the result of measurement. So, what is this world that we measure? What is it? What is it that is out there? If we cannot imagine something else for it to be, now you have a problem. But there is something obvious. Do we know anything that is not characterizable through physical properties? In other words, physical properties are quantities. Like this mouse has a certain number of inches in length, has a certain weight in ounces. These numbers, weight, length, these are physical properties. Is there anything that cannot be characterized in terms of inches, ounces, joules, coulombs, whatever? Of course there is. How many inches does your thought have?
Right.
What is the weight in ounces of your emotions? There
Right.
are states in nature, regardless of your philosophy, there are states in nature, and they are endogenous mental states that are not characterizable through physical quantities. So this proves that the kind of thing we need to exist for these experimental results to make sense, that kind of thing does exist. I'm not saying that the world is made of our thoughts. I don't think it is. Actually, obviously, it's not. But our thoughts are an instance of natural states that are not characterizable through physical quantities, and therefore they are not physical states, unless you make them physical by abstraction, by philosophical reduction. But that's theory, it's not fact. So the world could be made of its own endogenous experiential states that are not physical. And physical states arise from measurement. This is not difficult to understand. Let me give you an example. The sky has certain states. Points in the sky have different pressures. Wind has different directions. Clouds have certain forms and colors. When an airplane flies through the sky, the airplane has sensors that make measurements on the sky, the states of the sky, the real states out there.
Mhm.
And those measurements are presented to the pilot in the form of dashboard dial indications. And the pilot can fly based on those indications alone. The pilot doesn't need a transparent windshield. You can fly by instruments. That's what pilots do during a storm at night. They cannot see the sky as it is. They only have the instruments on the dashboard showing measurement results. Now, I submit to you that the physical world, colloquially physical, the world of colors and melodies and
Mhm.
textures and tastes and scents that we perceive around us, that's a dashboard. We also have sensors to measure our environment, just like the airplane has sensors to measure the sky. Our sensors are two retinas, two eardrums, taste buds on the tongue, mucous lining of the nose, and surface of the skin. And the results of those measurements are presented to us as the screen of perception, the things we perceive around us, just like the airplanes. Now, notice that if the airplane doesn't make any measurements, the dashboard shows nothing. Is this difficult to understand? Of course not. If you don't measure, the needles in the dials don't move. The
Yeah.
dashboard shows nothing. There's nothing to show. Nothing was measured. The same for us. If we don't measure the world, the screen of perception shows nothing. The only physical world that exists is the screen of perception. That's where physics starts. And physics uses numbers to describe the contents of the screen of perception in inches, in ounces. These are things we perceive qualitatively. My mouse is something I perceive qualitatively. I feel its weight, I sense its length. And we use numbers to describe these qualitative perceptions. So the hypothesis I submit to you is that the world as it is in itself, just like the sky outside the airplane, it is made of endogenous experiential states that may be completely unlike our thoughts or emotions, but they are experiential states. When we measure the world by observing it, we represent cognitively those states as colloquially physical states, as the screen of perception. In other words, the screen of perception is not a transparent window that shows us the world as it actually is, with its own structure. No, the screen of perception is a dashboard of dials. It shows to us our measurement results of the world. But the contents, the structure, and the dynamics of the screen of perception are not the structure and the dynamics of the world. They are a representation thereof that convey accurate information about the world. So if you see a train coming, don't step in front of it. And if you're a pilot and you ignore your dials, you're going to crash your plane. But that doesn't mean that the structure we call a train really exists in that form out there.
Right.
Just as the dial indications, although conveying important information about the sky, they don't constitute the structure of the sky. Clouds don't look like needles inside round dials. You see? So
Oh, yes, yeah.
that's what the experiment is showing us. Physical entities are cognitive representations of the world upon measurement. If you don't measure, there are no physical entities, just as there are no dial indications if the airplane sensors don't make a bloody measurement of the sky. Does that mean that if you're not measuring, there is no sky outside? Of course not. Even if there is no airplane flying around, there is still a sky. There is just no dashboard representation thereof.
Hmm.
So if there are no living beings looking at the world, of course there is still the world. There is just no physical world because the physical world is a dashboard representation of the real world. And you can use this to even understand the correlations between Alice and Bob.
Yes.
If you still have time, for
Oh,
2 more
yeah,
minutes,
of
I can
course. No,
extend this.
I have plenty of time.
We get discombobulated with the correlations between Alice's measurements and Bob's measurements, even though they make these measurements at the same time and they are separated by half the length of the universe. How is that possible? Speed of light limits should prevent these correlations, and yet
Right.
they are completely correlated. The error here is the following. Suppose you're a fan of soccer and you buy 2 enormous television screens to watch a soccer game from home. And you watch the soccer game through 2 different broadcasters, one broadcaster to the left and one broadcaster to the right, television to the left, television to the right. And the broadcasters have different cameras at the stadium. So the images in each television set are different, right? Because they are being captured by different cameras, different camera angles, and so on.
Yeah.
And you're watching the soccer game on these 2 channels at the same time in your living room. Nothing discombobulating about it. Now, suppose that you have a visitor from the 19th century. He comes in a time machine. He had never left the 19th century. He comes in a time machine and he pops next to you on your sofa and he's watching the soccer game with you on the 2 television screens. Our time traveler becomes discombobulated because the little man running around inside one box to the left move in a way that is completely synchronous and correlated with the little man running inside the box to the right.
Yeah.
Even though the boxes are separated. And the little men are not shouting across the boxes to know which way they are going. How can this
Yeah.
be?
That's a good
Magic.
analogy. That's a good
No,
analogy.
that's the magic of Alice and Bob. The error we make here is the error of our 19th century time traveler. The time traveler thinks that the images on the television screens are real, that they are the thing in itself, that there are real little men running inside the two boxes that are magically correlated with one another. If our time traveler understood that what the television sets show is not the thing in itself, but a representation thereof, that the thing in itself is in the stadium, it is incommensurable with the boxes. He wouldn't be surprised that the images are correlated because they're both different images of the same underlying reality. The boxes don't need to communicate for the correlation to be there because what they show is not reality, it's a representation thereof, a representation of the same underlying reality. This is what Alice and Bob are seeing. Particles A and B are not things in itself. They are not entities of the real world out there. They are images of the same underlying reality. When they are images of the same underlying reality, we say that they are entangled. And when they are images of different elements of the underlying reality, then they are not entangled, and then they are not correlated. But we have to be like 21st century people facing 21st century evidence instead of insisting on looking at 21st century evidence with the mind of 19th century people.
Oh,
The
yeah.
physical world is not the thing in itself. It's a dashboard representation thereof. And that's why we have entanglement correlations. The little men inside the television screens are images, they are representations, they are not actual little men.
Yes.
Particles are not actual structural elements of reality. They are representations
Hmm.
of underlying structural elements of reality.
Yes.
And this is a much more sane and plausible and economical hypothesis than gazillions of parallel universes popping up every infinitesimal fraction of a second that make the Big Bang look like a bank snap.
Right. It's maybe the most basic example of a map is not the territory issue. Like thinking, oh yes, this particle, this is a thing, but it's again, as you point out. And by the way, I think that was one of the best, most easy to understand analogies for the problem of why that spooky action at a distance seems so spooky. I like that analogy of the cameras, and you almost served it up for me perfectly with talking about how looking at modern phenomena through a 19th century lens doesn't make sense, and yet there are people from the 19th century, I guess more so from the 20th century. That's why I said you almost served it up for me perfectly. Like our mutual bygone friend Carl
Schopenhauer.
Jung, well, and
Oh, yeah.
Schopenhauer. Um, but I had to bring up Jung because since we spoke last, you wrote a whole book about him, and like I said, he's been a huge influence on me as well. And I heard you talk a little bit in another interview about where your interest in Jung sprouted up. And I wanted to say too, though, before I kick it back to you, that I think it sounds like a lot of your misgivings and dissatisfaction about trying to explain the world in only empirical terms, which eventually pushed you deep into philosophy, was essentially the very same uh, issue that pushed Jung into the psyche and into the realm of symbol and myth, because he could not square these like strange subjective meaningful experiences he would have with just being weird meaningless misfires of neurochemistry or whatever the popular empirical explanation of the day would have been. He intuitively felt that all of these experiences he was having in dreams, or he was visions he was having, had meaning, and there was something real and important contained within those images. And it seems like you two really harmonize in that point about not being comfortable reducing everything down to the empirical level, so you're forced into this realm that is a bit more controversial academically, but I think when you talk to the common person, they all intuitively are with you, and that no, there is something more there, and we need to take it seriously, and we need to implement all of the intellectual rigor and artful rigor that we can possibly put on to that chasm, because there is something important there.
I understand the spirit of your question, but just to set the record straight,
Yes,
I am an empirical reductionist. Um, if you define empiricism broadly, but even if you don't, I mean, I unlike Jung, I am not basing myself on introspection.
true.
Um, because I want to reinforce that other side of the coin. I want to show that even if you were incapable of introspection, you would still have enough objective empirical reason and analytic reasoning to adopt idealism. But I am a reductionist. I am an extreme reductionist. I want to reduce everything to one thing, a
Okay,
field of
yeah,
subjectivity underlying all
yes.
nature. I'm an extreme reductionist. I'm a naturalist in the sense that I think nature unfolds spontaneously and not out of a deliberate plan by a self-conscious cosmic mind. I think self-reflection is an ability that we evolved over the eons because of evolution by natural selection, and not something that is already there from the beginning. Otherwise, the world would be a little better than it is now. I think. So I'm a naturalist. I'm a reductionist. But what you're suggesting is that from a in a broad sense, empiricism also requires you to take the reality of our introspective states into account, because our introspective states too are a part of nature. What else could they be? Our introspective states are real realities. Our feelings are not nothing. They exist, they are experienced, and that's part of nature. Even if it is in some sense illusory, that illusion is not nothing. It's still a part of nature, even if it doesn't correspond to some objective state of affairs out there. And that's what Jung did. He took introspective states seriously. He didn't require them to be literally true in the sense of corresponding to non-mental objective states out there. No, that's not what he did. Even if they are in some sense delusional, they are still something. It's not nothing. The psyche is not nothing. The psyche is real as such, as psyche. That was his point. And as parts of nature, you have to find a way to account for that. You may account for that as some kind of illusion, but even in that case, you have to account for it coherently as an illusion. In what way is this an illusion? How does the illusion arise? Where does it come from? Why does it have the structure it has? What are the causal chains involved here? You see, even if you call them illusions, you still have to account for them as such. And that's the problem Jung faced. He needed to account for inner states that, even if you declare them to be illusions, you would still have a problem accounting for them as such. And that's the challenge he took upon himself, to account for them. Illusory or not, you have to provide an explicit account. And that's what Jung did with the notion of the archetypes and synchronicity and collective unconscious and all that good stuff.
Yeah, yeah, and I guess perhaps where the two of you bifurcate is in Memories, Dreams, Reflections. I recall him talking about how the reason he became so fluent in mythological imagery and alchemy and art was because he could not explain these mental states through any empirical measurement or system. And by that I mean, like, I know I understand what you're saying in terms of you're a reductionist in that you take consciousness to be everything to be reducible to consciousness, but there's no um measurement tool that we have to say I've got this X number of consciousness, right? So because of that, that's what led Jung to become fluent in mythological language and take dreams seriously and all of these psychic images seriously, because he had no other scientific tool or apparatus to make sense of it. But it seems like you haven't given up on that. I know I know, of course, we're not talking about being able to reduce consciousness down to some other map because that's problematic, as we've already discussed. But I guess there, you still think there's another avenue available to you other than going down the mythological, the mythopoetic Jungian route.
Well, there is the avenue of laboratory evidence, objectively collected, and the avenue of rational thinking. I'm a rationalist too. So even if you disregard your inner experiential states that you can measure through introspection, so to say, you are the instrument of measurement now, even if you disregard those, there are still two other avenues to collect knowledge that seem to be more aligned with the ethos of Western mentality these days. Personally, in my personal life, I take all three seriously. It's just that in my work, I focus on two of them and
Mhm.
not the third because a bunch of other people already focus on the third. So I don't need to do anything there, I feel. But all three, I think, are relevant. And all three dovetail very nicely if one has the the critical discipline to really extract what these inner states are telling us without being deceived by them. Because mind, I like to call it the prime directive of mind. Mind's first natural impulse is to deceive itself.
Hmm.
It's to tell itself little stories and narratives that make it feel that that things are meaningful, things are rich, and feel enthusiastic about things. So, what introspective states really tell you is not the face value, surface level of inner narratives. You have to go one level deeper and analyze where those face value narratives are coming from and what that means that that stuff is emerging from lower layers in our mentation. And that's what Jung did. Jung didn't take the myths arising from the so called unconscious, which was conscious in the modern sense. And his definition of consciousness was a lot more restricted than phenomenal consciousness today. That's why he called it the unconscious. But what he
Yeah.
meant is conscious states that are not cognitively linked through associations and which are not reachable through metacognitive introspection. And therefore, the unconscious is consciousness that is not reachable through cognitive, metacognitive introspection. But he didn't take those narratives emerging from the unconscious literally. He dug one layer deep. So, what does this mean about the mind that is generating these narratives? What is this mind trying to do through these seeming uh, artifacts of self deception? And that is his great merit. He took the mind seriously, but not literally,
Hmm.
because we confuse today taking the mind seriously for gullibly gulping down the self deception. And that's not the point. The point is not to believe all the crap that your mind makes up. The point is to dig one layer deeper and understand why is the mind doing that stuff? Why
Yes.
is it generating those narratives? Where's that coming from? What needs to be really there, the foundations of mind for this stuff to come up in the first place? And that's what Jung did. It's not my work. I'm not an introspection guy. I may even be that in my personal life, but not in my outward output, in my outward production. But it was Jung's gift. And he also took statistical evidence
Hmm.
seriously.
Hmm.
There is this famous case. He was once in a nut house
Yeah.
um, talking to a patient who was completely schizophrenic, totally incoherent. And he asked his patient was looking out the window with a fixed stare. And he came next to this patient and asked him, "What are you seeing?" And the patient said, "Look, the sun has a penis and it moves from left to right. And that's where the wind is coming from." And at the time, he thought, yeah, okay, he's just a nut. What can you make of this? Right? He's just a nut. And then 4 or 5 years later, a technical article was published in which scholars had finally translated an old papyrus maybe not from Egypt, I think it was from Mesopotamia, a very old document which contained some myths from a couple of thousand years ago.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And one of those myths is that the mistral wind comes from the sun's penis, and it goes in different directions depending on whether the sun's penis is pointing one way or the other. And Jung was just floored
Yeah.
because that thing had just been translated, had just been published. And even if not was the case, the patient in question was locked up in a nut house for years, and he was schizophrenic. He certainly didn't read the literature, the technical literature, right, of anthropology. And so he realized that even our crazy narratives, our illusions, our inner imagery that doesn't correspond to external empirical facts of the world out there, even those seem to have a common source.
Yeah.
They seem to sort of sprout out from a spring of imagery that has some built-in collective templates. And he called those templates the archetypes.
Yeah.
And
And
the
the
archetypes are
Unus
collective. They
Mundus. Yeah.
underlie all nature, not only human minds, they underlie all nature.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and his idea of the Unus Mundus that he liked to talk about, this hidden one world kind of binding psychic force that pervaded everything. I think he pretty closely related that to the idea of the Tao as well. And so it seems like your notion of our private consciousness and whatever the true reality out there is pretty correlated to that idea, to this Unus Mundus, this kind of Tao that we can't quite understand, but we can sort of. I mean, for me, like my only way to make sense of it is to intellectually trace it back, rationally trace it back in a sort of Jungian tradition where, in a more mundane sense, if you want to get to the core of a self-sabotaging behavior, it's likely that you're going to have to go deeper than the soil of the conscious mind into the shadow slash unconscious, and it may be a painful symbolic emotional soil tilling process to understand that a little bit better. But for you, whether it's subjective or objective, it's there's something that can be proven there, experimented on there. So ultimately my question is, do you draw the same conclusion? Do you have a word you prefer to use? Because like I said, it's Unus Mundus, Tao. I mean, before we were talking about like the ground level of consciousness that Dzogchen talks about, or the one, or whatever. Is there a word or you like to use, or are all of those things too broad and blunt and symbolic for your liking?
They are not precise.
Right.
Words like the Tao, even the collective unconscious, uh, they are not precise, and they have all kinds of connotations that are not under my control. And because I work under the analytic tradition in philosophy, which has been around for 100 years now, um, I try not to use imprecise terms. But of course, these words that come from the philosophical and religious mystical traditions of the world, they are much richer than the word I'm about to use. They contain, they mean a lot more. They
Right.
convey more nuance, more subtlety, more of the implications, more of the felt qualities of what it's referring to, as opposed to just saying there is a field of subjectivity that is spatially unbound and underlies all nature, which is how I describe it.
Mm.
I would describe it as a field of subjectivity. Any individual experience with particular qualities anywhere in the universe is just a pattern of excitation of this underlying field. And this idea is borrowed from quantum field theory, which says that physical properties are just patterns of excitations of underlying quantum fields. So we can port that, sort of transpose that to philosophy and say there is only one field of subjectivity, one mind across all nature, and all experiences are patterns of excitation of it. And therefore, there can be infinite experiences because any field can have essentially infinite different patterns of excitation. And what are we? Well, we are dissociated segments of this underlying field. And dissociation in the scope of mind is something that is now fairly well understood by psychiatry, something we know exists. It can literally make you blind to what is right in front of your healthy, open eyes. We know that from experiments since 2015. Dissociation can make you blind even though your eyes work and you are and they are open, and you don't register any activity in the visual cortex if you are dissociated. So we know this stuff can blind us to our cognitive surroundings. And that's what we are. That's why we have private conscious inner lives and we don't know what's happening in the galaxy of Andromeda. We are dissociated mental processes in this underlying field of subjectivity that spans all nature. And our experiences too are patterns of excitation, dissociated excitation of this underlying field of subjectivity. I think this is precise. I think it is correct, but it doesn't say much. Actually, it doesn't say almost anything. It just tells you the basics. It just tells you what the ontic nature is of reality. But it doesn't go ahead and tell you anything about how it works, how it feels, what it is like to be it as a whole, what it's trying to achieve. It doesn't say any of this stuff. That is very relevant. And why do I make this choice? Because I want to have I want to propose a story that we can all buy into as a culture, as a safe story. But in order for it to be safe and reliable and plausible, it has to be limited because we are monkeys. We cannot know much with any reliability. To know with reliability, we have to know little.
Right.
So I propose that little. This little, which is already very significant
Yeah.
because it contradicts our mainstream storyline already. It's a very significant little, but it is little and it is reliable. And we can leave it then to the introspective traditions to say more about that little,
Mm-hmm.
to add more to that edifice of description, to give more context, to give more nuance, to give more subtlety, to give more insight, with the risk that it's less reliable. It's something that you have to take with a grain of salt and evaluate critically, not ignore, but be critical about it. And it's worth doing that. It's worth speculating further. It's worth investigating further through introspection. But we will always have that reliable story to fall back to. And that's
Yeah.
what I'm trying to do, to build that reliable but limited foundation. And therefore, I don't talk about the Tao, I talk about the underlying field of subjectivity.
Well, just for fun. So I remember last time we spoke, one of the things I do remember is, putting forth this idea that has become, popular, like in a more new age sense, but it does have older roots, like this idea that we're all put here for a very specific reason. We're all learning something. We're all, almost like it's some kind of school. And you did not like this idea, and we had a laugh about it. And you're like, no, I think we are the product of evolution. We are evolving. We are doing something. And I recall Jung writing something toward the end of his life very similar to that sentiment in a much more kind of mythopoetic way, in a kind of I can't
I
regurgitate
remember.
it. Yeah, I can't regurgitate it exactly, but it's something along the lines of like, we are carrying the fire forward. We are psycheing. We are godding. Like, what we're doing matters. There's unfinished work to do. Our individuation matters. Um, and I like that idea. But a lot of these, one of the conclusions that a lot of the mystical traditions draw is it's actually a bit of an aberration. Like, human existence, they agree with your uh, reducibility of everything to this pervasive consciousness, but that the way a human consciousness comes into being is like, maybe we're not quite boils on the complexion of that united
consciousness, but or zits or something on collective on the Unus Mundus. Zits on the Unus Mundus. That's what we are. Um, Maybe not quite that far, but that it's somehow consciousness getting stuck in an enamorment in a mirrored state with itself. And this is why a lot of these traditions essentially encourage you to try to subjugate the ego to a deeper level of consciousness, is because your ego is actually a painful outgrowth of reality. But it doesn't seem like that's where you're coming from. Am I wrong about that?
I do think the ego is a painful outgrowth.
Hmm.
It's something we've evolved, and but I will acknowledge what you described as a sort of a zit, an anomaly, something that is
Yeah.
difficult to account for. Human beings, among all the other animals and living beings that there are out there, human beings are particularly difficult to account for because of our ability to self reflect,
Yeah.
our ability to use symbols that refer to things that are not the symbols themselves, like words, to think symbolically. And the reason this is difficult to account for, there's a great book about it. It's called Masters of the Planet
Hmm.
by Ian Tattersall, curator of this the section of human history, I think, of the American Museum of Natural History in New York. Um, the point is the following: we have existed physically, anatomically, in the present form for 200 to 300,000 years. In other words, we have the genes today that humans of 200,000 years ago already had,
Mm-hmm.
but our ability to think symbolically through words, for instance, to think conceptually, to devise theories, to be self-aware, to reflect and deliberate, to plan, these abilities popped up between 50 and 30,000 years ago, which is very difficult to account for because it means that whatever genetic mutation has enabled this ability, it was already there since 2 or 300,000 years, but it only became manifest 30,000 years ago or 50. And so, why was it fixed in our genome? Because it's an extraordinary ability, unrivaled in the rest of nature. Nothing else thinks symbolically like we do conceptually. So it was a fantastic mutation. And then it happened, but was not useful. It was not used at all for at least 150,000 years, maybe 270,000 years, even, until one animal that contained that genetic mutation suddenly started using it to tremendous effect, because the moment we started using it, we became able to collaborate, create a civilization, and completely dominate the world in in 30,000 years, which is,
Yeah.
it's not even yesterday from an evolutionary perspective. It's hardly the blink of an eye ago. It just happened. So, uh, as Ian Tattersall puts it in his book, I can quote it word by word. The only reason we have to imagine that such a thing is possible at all is that obviously it happened. How can such a dramatic, world changing, literally, genetic mutation happen and be fixed without being used until one of its possessors suddenly discovered it 200,000 years later? I mean, this is beyond implausible. It is stupefying. That's not how evolution normally works. The way evolution normally works is that you run around with your random genetic mutations, the environment suddenly changes, and the ones amongst the population that happen to have random mutations that were useful given the changes in the environment, those are the ones that survive and everybody else dies.
Yeah.
In other words, genetic mutations that become fixed are the ones that are immediately conducive to fitness, the ones that are immediately useful. But this, the most spectacular mutation ever in the history of life on planet Earth, took place and was affixed in the genome without being used for over 200,000 years. What?
Yeah.
What the
Yeah.
hell?
Yeah.
This is stupefying. And I acknowledge that. This makes human beings more difficult to account than whales, dolphins, pachyderms, elephants, whatever you pick. We are a tough nut to crack. It doesn't mean that it cannot be cracked naturalistically. I think it can, but we are the living embodiment of something absolutely phenomenal and unique that has taken place in nature. Unique. It has not happened a second time. And this is sobering, yeah.
Yeah. So in your mind, do you ascribe that incredibly unlikely twist of evolutionary circumstance, do you ascribe that to some level of agency by this collective consciousness, by this pervasive subjective awareness?
I don't think the mind of nature is sitting there somewhere deliberately drawing plans or capriciously intervening in the unfolding of nature, like sticking the finger into the painting to make changes here and there. I don't think that's how it works. I think nature unfolds in a way that is self consistent and spontaneous. In other words,
Mm.
not deliberate. Nature is the expression of its own built in templates, the laws of nature, if you want to call them that way. I would not go as far as to characterize them as purely mechanical. There's plenty of evidence that that's not actually a correct characterization, but I think nonetheless that they are self consistent and spontaneous. Having said that, it is possible that there are organizing principles in nature that only kick in at high levels of organization, high levels of complexity, and therefore cannot be isolated under laboratory conditions. Under laboratory conditions in which we can control all experimental circumstances, you are structurally limited to finding out microscopic organizing principles in nature. That's what we do at CERN, for instance. We look at the microscopic behavior of nature and we find out what those microscopic principles are. And we call them the basic laws of nature, which are embodied in the standard model of particle physics today. And we like to think that everything can be reduced to those microscopic principles, that everything is sort of the compound result of the local microscopic application of those microscopic principles. Now, we cannot explicitly make that reduction because it's an explosion of complexity. We cannot even explain large, complex molecules in terms of the laws of quantum mechanics, quantum field theory, let alone explain a living being. It's impossible. But we like to think that it is explainable in principle, even though we don't have computers powerful enough to bridge that gap. We like to think that the only organizing principles in nature are microscopic ones. Why? Well, because those are the only ones we can isolate in a laboratory and discover with any confidence. Now, we cannot impose on nature ontologically our own epistemic limitations, that we cannot isolate broader, more complex organizing principles in nature doesn't mean that they don't exist. They may exist. It's just that we cannot isolate them
Yeah.
under laboratory conditions. And if they do exist, and this is pure speculation now, if they do exist, this this organizing principles in nature that only kick in at high levels of complexity over large distances and not only microscopically, if they do exist, they may help account for this otherwise incomprehensible jump that humans have made in the evolutionary chain. This is pure speculation,
Mm-hmm.
but it's speculation that I personally do entertain. Why? Because I'm forced to entertain it, because there doesn't seem to be any other way.
Yeah.
And you become just discombobulated unless you start speculating in those directions, that there is a natural, spontaneous, self-consistent organizing principle in nature that only kicks in at high complexity levels, and that may
Yeah.
account for our existence. Maybe.
Yeah, and you're starting to overlap with that book I was talking about a little bit, the Romance of Reality, how there seems to be this slant, I'm forgetting the technical term, but essentially it's a slant toward complexity, that the universe actually has an innate tendency to complexify. And if it didn't, I mean, we start getting into absolutely ridiculous statistical improbability. And how you explain that capacity, that innate slant toward complexity, is a very interesting thing. And it seems like it's actually a pretty well studied field. Man, I wish I could remember the word. I'm sure you know the word, um, but yeah, it absolutely is thought provoking. But I guess to kind of slightly shift the question, is there any bleeding edge physics, bleeding edge thought that has you excited, that you think is going in the right
Yeah,
direction in this respect?
yeah. There is an effort generally called the physics of first person perspective,
Hmm.
that I think is a, a fine and rigorous distillation of physics as a science as opposed to a philosophy. And by freeing physics from all kinds of hidden metaphysical, philosophical assumptions, it may open avenues of investigation in physics that we were blind to before. One major metaphysical prejudice in physics that has nothing to do with science, it's purely metaphysical, is the notion that physics studies the actual world as it is. This is a metaphysical prejudice because what experiment can tell us, what our predictive models, our theories tell us, is what nature will do next. That's what prediction is. That's what scientific prediction is. We predict what nature will do next. There is no built in assumption naturally in this that this prediction is a prediction of what the world as it is in itself out there actually is. No, there is no statement about what the world, what nature is. There is no statement that physics studies nature as it is. All it says is, what will we see next? That's what physics does. It predicts what we will see next, because that's what the experiment shows. You have a theory that predicts what we will see next. You run the experiment and we see, or
Right.
not. And that's science. That's physics. That's physics freed of metaphysical prejudices. And there is a group of people now. Uh, um, Marcus Miller always comes to my mind from the Austrian Academy of Sciences, who is a colleague of one of the winners of the Nobel
Oh,
Prize in
really?
Physics last year. Um, but there is a whole group of people who understood this, who understood that a lot of what is presupposed in physics is metaphysics. It's not physics. And by presupposing all that stuff uncritically, we are not looking in the right places. We are becoming discombobulated when we shouldn't, like Alice and Bob are becoming
Right.
discombobulated when they shouldn't. They're only discombobulated because they have metaphysical prejudices. If they were just thinking in terms of what will we see next, now you can open you can open new avenues of investigation, and you can cut off anchors of prejudice that were preventing progress, and you also avoid the circus of science fiction like bullshit speculation that's happening in physics today, you know, like superdeterminism and the Everett interpretation of multiverses and all that stuff. And I find this incredibly promising because, for instance, it opens an avenue to account for the fine tuning problem in naturalistic terms.
Ah, yeah. Yeah.
It's very difficult for us to say, if you're a naturalist, it's very difficult to account for the fact that some basic fundamental constants in nature are so precisely fine-tuned for the emergence of complexity in
Yeah.
life that to think that it's by pure chance is like it defies rationality. So how can we account for that naturalistically? Well, if you understand physics as predicting what we will see next, then the physical world is a construct. It's a theoretical construct of our cognition. What we call the physical world is not what is really out there objectively. It is a construct to account for what we expect to see next. The physical world is not standalone, it is a human construct. And you can even prove mathematically that even if we do not share the same world, we would all end up constructing similar physical worlds. Statistically, you can
Yeah.
show that. Mathematically, you can show that.
Yeah.
Now, think about it. If the physical world is a construct of ours, then for that construct to be consistent, it has to be such that it can account for our presence in that construct, for our presence in the physical world. We would inevitably construct the physical world in a way that is consistent with our own existence. Of course, otherwise there would be an internal contradiction, and cognitively that would be rejected. If we constructed the physical world, not the real world out there, that's not what I'm talking about. There is a real world out there, it's just not physical. If we construct the physical world as a theoretical and cognitive prop to provide expectations that are conducive to survival, we would inevitably do that in a way that is consistent with our existence. And our existence requires complexity. And complexity requires fine tuning. Ergo, we construct a fine tuned physical world.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful naturalistic way to account for what I consider the most discombobulating of the three challenges we have for naturalism today.
Yeah.
The one being fine tuning, the second being the existence of human self reflection, although we had the genes for that dozens of thousands of years before we put that to use. And the third one being the UAP phenomenon. These are
Oh,
the
yeah.
three challenges for the naturalist today.
Oof, we didn't
And I
even
think
yeah.
the physics of first person perspective accounts for the most discombobulating of them. And I just love it. I just love it.
Yeah,
I mean,
that's
it
great.
can account for it. It has not been explicitly accounted for yet. The people doing physics of first person perspective didn't even look at the fine tuning problem yet. So this is, if it turns out that what I'm saying is bullshit, then it's my bullshit. It's not their bullshit. They didn't even look into it yet. It's just my personal enthusiasm that I finally found at least a direction that seems promising to account for fine-tuning naturalistic sense, which is what I want to do. It's my personal prejudice.
That makes sense. That makes sense. And you triggered in my mind when you said fine tuning. That's the road I was going down. And then also the anthropic principle. That's the other thing I was trying to think of. And I guess we didn't specifically say, but fine tuning is essentially, if you've never heard this before, it's what it sounds like, that we live in a universe that has just the right rules, just the right laws of physics, so that complex life can emerge, and that if you turn the dial just a little bit on the weak force or the strong force, it would all collapse. Like, we would not be able to live in a coherent universe, at least not as these kinds of beings. Yet here we are. Anyway, my friend, you brought up a whole other can of worms with UAPs. I didn't even think to bring that up to you, man. And I would love to talk to you about that. I think that maybe that can be a jumping off point next time, unless you have some quick thoughts on that you want to let fly.
Oh, just to justify why I listed it, I think the vast majority of what is reported and talked about in the UFO community is just a huge pile of steamy shit. It's just bullshit. It's
Yeah.
just made up stuff to sell to appear on television. It follows no rationality, no empirical rigor, nothing. It's just nonsense. The vast majority. And all I have for it is disdain. So let me put it that way. So much disdain that I feel discouraged to even search the literature these days,
Mm.
because it takes so much effort to find something, and before you find it, you have to smell the shit so much that it discourages me from doing that. But there is stuff out there that you just cannot shove under the carpet. And that stuff shows us that certain organizing principles in nature that we think of as very fundamental, such as the principle of inertia, uh, are not. Because something out there, I don't think it's aliens from another planet, by the way.
Hmm.
I think it's from here, it's of here, and
Hmm.
has always been here. There is something out there that doesn't obey it, that throws the law of inertia out the window, throws the notion of conservation of momentum out the window. And that's troubling. That's
Yeah.
troubling.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, are you familiar with Jung's riff on UFOs?
Yeah, yeah, but his notion of UFOs as a projection,
Yeah.
a mental
A mental
projection that
projection.
actually acquires physical form, I think it can account for a lot, but I don't think it can account for the modern parts of the UAP phenomenon that are associated with the military.
Right. Yeah. And I used to be a lot more warm to that idea. But then, there are seemingly at least thought provoking accounts of actual objects being captured or witnessed or physically, interacting with people. And again, how do you separate the shit from Shinola? How do you separate the reports from reality? And I don't know how you do that. I don't know how
Well,
you.
the Jung could account for the physical part of the phenomenon as well, the objectively measurable part with radars and all that. Because although this is subtle, for Jung, the physical world is itself a manifestation of the collective unconscious. So
Yes.
it is itself mental. It just presents itself to us physically on the dashboard. But it, as it is in itself, the so-called physical world, the colloquially physical world, is mental in essence and operates according to the same archetypes as the human mind. So therefore, an archetypal evocation in the human mind can coherently correspond to an archetypal manifestation in the world at large, physically. So he could account even for the physical manifestation of the phenomenon. The reason why I said I don't think it accounts for the military aspect of it is more subtle and also less strong and less definite. The reason is that people in the military, they, I think they are less susceptible to psychological projection
Hmm.
when they are in the job because they are trained um, to perform the job in a certain way that doesn't leave much room open for um, visionary manifestations, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And they are focused on instrumentation, they are focused on the mission plan, they are focused on the procedures, and there are many of them usually involved, all of them equally focused on the very ground level concrete aspects of the mission they have to carry out. This is not fertile ground for mass level projections that could acquire physical form. um, that's why I made this exception. It's not a clear cut reason to say Jung's theory cannot account for it. It's not that clear cut. In principle, it could, but I don't think in practice it is plausible that this whole thing is just an archetypal projection of human beings that resonates with the physical world and gains physical embodiment. It looks like there is an independent agency behind it.
Yeah.
Um, and if that is so, and if that agency can disregard organizing principles in nature that we consider fundamental, such as conservation of
Yeah.
momentum and the law of inertia, because these are the two most clearest ones, they also disregard Aristotelian logic, by the way. But we need another conversation to
Yeah.
talk about
Yeah.
that part. The fact that there seems to be an agency that can disregard these things,
Yeah.
that's a challenge to the naturalist mindset, which is my mindset. It's uncomfortable to me. It's not as uncomfortable as the fine tuning, but the fine tuning I thought of, I satisfied myself that there are ways to deal with it.
Yeah.
Human self reflection, I'm not completely satisfied yet. And the UAP phenomenon, I'm totally not satisfied.
Oh
I'm still
yeah.
discombobulated about that.
Yeah, and seemingly it violates thermodynamics as well because the account is always that there's not a heat signature, there's no obvious, source of energy that's allowing it to propel itself across space. It's just moving in extraordinarily stochastic ways, confusing ways that don't seem like they should be possible. But I have to ask you, you say once you get beyond the pile of steaming bullshit, there is something there. What is the something there that has intrigued you the most?
I am intrigued by what Jacques Vallée says.
Mm-hmm.
I am intrigued by what's his name, the scientist from Stanford that has.
Oh, Avi Loeb?
No. The microbiologist from
Oh,
Stanford.
hmm.
Dolan, I think. No, Nolan Dolan.
I don't think I'm
A
familiar.
blonde guy
Is he
from.
one of the guys who's looked at supposed exotic materials?
Yeah,
Okay.
I forgot his name. He intrigues me because he comes across to me as viscerally honest. He even, the signs of honesty are subtle and can be and usually misinterpreted. I'll tell you a name which probably will be the last name that you would imagine I would put forward as somebody who is honest and telling the truth. Um, Whitley Strieber,
Okay.
I think, is telling the truth. Um,
I thought you
the
were going to say Bob
signs,
Lazar.
no, I did
Not a
not say
fan.
that. No,
That's
did
what
not
I
say
okay,
that.
okay.
Uh, Honesty, when it expresses itself unreservedly, it bears itself naked to risk and ridicule.
Hmm.
This is one of the characteristics of honesty. When you don't adapt and tune and embellish your story so it fits more with the mainstream cultural narrative to avoid ridicule. When you don't do that, when you just say it as it is, and you run the risk of being ridiculed, that tends to be a sign of honesty. And also consistency over time and the subtlety of certain observations that people don't really come up with arbitrarily. And Strieber has some very, very subtle things he says that you smell like, oh, okay, he has seen something here.
Hmm.
This is not made up stuff.
I don't know if I
This is
know there's
not what the idiots normally come up with.
I don't know if I know his story. What's his story?
You can read Communion,
Oh,
his
him. Okay, okay.
1988 book.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
Now, similarly, I think this Stanford scientist is being honest not only because he talks scientific language in a rigorous way. It's very easy for idiots to take scientific terminology and make a mess of it. They
Sure.
very quickly show their hand,
I
and
do it all
they
the
show that
time.
not you, but they show that they do not really understand what they are talking about. They know the words, but they don't know what they actually mean. And this guy from Stanford, he's a true scientist. He's consistent and coherent in what he's saying, and he openly talks about his own abduction experiences,
Oh, really?
which is somebody who is trying to ride his academic reliability does not do.
That's
You
true.
only do that when your agenda is, I'll just be honest. Even if I'm wrong, I'll just be honest. So I smell that in him. And Vallée has always impressed me as a good thinker. He has been the target of recent criticism for seemingly taking people too much at face value, trusting people too much. I think there may be something to this criticism recently, but he has a body of work that spans 50 years, more now, 54 years.
Yeah.
I think his first book is from the late 60s, 55 years even. And I think the majority of that body of work is intriguing. For instance, he doesn't fall for the little naive fairy tale that, oh, it's just organic aliens from another star system that came here in metal spaceships to do a survey. Bullshit. The evidence is not consistent with this. The evidence is much more discombobulating than this. This is a sort of very pedestrian little hypothesis that doesn't account for the depth of the mystery we have in our hands. So he doesn't fall for that, and I admire that. So I just mentioned three names
Yeah.
that range from one you would expect me to say, like the Stanford scientist
Yeah.
and Jacques Vallée, and one you would not expect me to say, like Whitley Strieber. Now, notice even the sincere people can make a mess of their experience later on, because human beings, in order to incorporate their life experiences, even the difficult and traumatic ones, they need to come up with stories. That's part of psychological integration. And human beings are prone to making a mess of what was the original data, by weaving narratives about it later on, in order to try to create space for it in their worldview, and account for it in some way that is psychologically integrative. So Whitley is no exception to that. I am not, you are not, nobody is, Whitley is not. And he has been talking about it for almost 40 years now. So I'm sure you will be able to find statements from him that you can ridicule. In the process of trying to psychologically integrate this stuff later on, you will inevitably fall
Yeah.
into lines of speculation that are not productive and that are fantastical. But I do think the origin of it all and his personality as a whole is the personality of somebody who is being sincere, and did not calculate the risk of being ridiculed, and who just went with the sincerity. Some people are like that. There are people like that. I think he's one of them.
Yeah. Very interesting. It hasn't been that long since our first conversation, maybe I don't know, 3 years. But when you think about how much some of these topics have matured in that time, it really is mind-blowing. I mean, the UAP conversation was much more difficult to have with sincerity and nuance. AI was nothing even approaching what's public facing now. So I mean, who knows where we're going, where things are going to be next. We could talk again in a few months, and it would probably be the high weirdness would be dialed up to levels that we would just no. I don't think that's possible. I don't think any human being will be married to an extraterrestrial with an AI implant by that point. But hey, who knows? But it's been a lot of fun, my friend. I can't believe it's been like 2.5 hours. I love rapping with you. I didn't even ask you what you're working on. But if there is anything, please let us know.
I'm
Please,
working on
yeah,
2 books, but I'm not really talking much about them yet. I talk if I'm asked directly about it, but if I'm not volunteering information about the 2 books yet. It's still boiling in my mind,
that's
or
fair.
coming through, still coming through.
That's fair. All right, my friend. Well, thanks for doing this. I will, of course, put any links in the description you would like me to. And I would love to have you back.
I'll come with pleasure. Thanks for having me, Michael.